My name is Renee. I am 28 years old, and I never thought my own mother would put a price tag on my life. $200,000. That was the exact amount printed on the cashier check my mother Vera slammed onto the glass coffee table of my tiny apartment. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my face and told me to pack my things because my 5-year relationship was over. I was being sold to a wealthy family in Atlanta to act as a glorified nurse for their paralyzed son. If you are watching this from somewhere where family drama hits close to home, take a moment to like and subscribe. Trust me, you will want to hear how I turned their blood money into their biggest nightmare. I stared at the crisp piece of paper resting next to my stack of medical billing textbooks. The zeros blurred together into a dizzying line. My mother stood over me with her hands on her hips. Her designer dress and expensive jewelry looked completely out of place in my cramped, faintly mildewed living room. "Call Jamal right now and tell him it is over," she commanded. Her voice was ice-cold, devoid of any maternal warmth. "You are marrying DeAndre tomorrow. His family has already drawn up the paperwork." I shook my head, my brain completely unable to process the sheer audacity of her demand. "Are you out of your mind?" I whispered, clutching the edge of the sofa. "I am not marrying a total stranger. I love Jamal. We have been together for 5 years. We are building a life together." My older sister Monique stepped out from my small kitchen, swirling a glass of my cheap grocery store wine. She laughed a high-pitched grating sound that immediately set my teeth on edge. "Building a life. Please, Renee. Jamal works retail and drives a busted sedan that breaks down every other week. You audit medical bills for pennies. You two are not building a life, you are building a shack." Monique always had a way of making me feel microscopic. She was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. She was married to Garrett, a white tech bro, who supposedly had the world on a string and a massive startup company. They lived in a gated community, drove European cars, and looked down on everyone else. "Then why do you need this money?" I shot back, pointing a trembling finger at the check on the table. "If Garrett is so incredibly successful and wealthy, why are the two of you here ambushing me in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon?" Vera slammed her hand on the table, rattling the glass surface. "Do not speak to your sister that way," she snapped. "Garrett is going through a very stressful transitional phase with his startup. The market is tough. They need a quick cash injection right now, or the bank is going to seize their company assets. And my house is tied up as collateral. If Garrett goes down, I lose the family home. I lose everything." "So you are selling me?" I asked, my voice cracking as the horrifying reality set in. "You are auctioning me off to save Garrett and his failing company. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement," Monique chimed in smoothly, taking another sip of wine. "DeAndre was in a horrible car accident a year ago. He is completely paralyzed from the waist down. His family is old money true Atlanta royalty. They absolutely refuse to put him in an assisted living facility. They want someone young, presentable, and capable to take care of him and play the devoted wife in public. They offered $200,000 in cash for the right candidate. Garrett set the whole thing up through one of his wealthy business contacts." I felt a wave of intense nausea wash over me. My own brother-in-law was brokering my marriage to save his sinking ship of a career. "You cannot force me to do this," I said, lunging for my phone on the counter. "I am calling Jamal right now. We will move away. I will block your numbers. You cannot legally make me marry anyone." Vera lunged forward and snatched the phone right out of my hand. "You listen to me, you selfish, ungrateful little girl," she hissed, her face inches from mine. "I gave you life. I clothed you. I fed you for 18 years. You have always been the difficult one in this family, always causing trouble, never contributing a single dime to our legacy. Now it is your turn to give back and prove your loyalty. If you walk out that door, you are dead to me. You will never speak to any of us again. I will make sure everyone in our church and our entire community knows you abandoned your own mother to face bankruptcy and homelessness." Monique leaned in closer, the smell of her expensive floral perfume practically suffocating me. "Think about it logically, Renee. You get to live in a massive mansion. You just have to push a wheelchair around, feed him his medication, and smile for the cameras. It is infinitely better than the pathetic, exhausting life you are living right now. Do this for the family. Do this for Mom. Ooh. Hot tears spilled down my cheeks, burning my skin. They had meticulously backed me into a corner. I knew Vera never made empty threats. She controlled the social narrative in our family and our church. She would ruin my reputation, isolate me from every relative, and make me a complete pariah. Garrett needs this money cleared by Friday. Vera continued, her tone softening. Just a fraction. A classic manipulation tactic I had seen 1,000 times. DeAndre and his lawyers have the prenuptial agreement completely ready to sign. You get absolutely nothing if you try to divorce him, but you get a luxury roof over your head and a black card for living expenses. We get the $200,000 to save the business. It is a sacrifice, yes, but it is what family does for each other. I looked at the cashier check again. My entire future, my quiet dreams of starting a family with Jamal, my fundamental freedom, all reduced to a single piece of paper. It was meant to bail out a man who barely acknowledged my existence at Thanksgiving dinner. The sheer, calculated cruelty of my own mother paralyzed me more than any physical injury ever could. I will give you exactly 1 hour to pack a suitcase, Vera said, turning her back on me and heading toward the front door. The private driver is waiting downstairs right now. Say goodbye to this dump, Renee. You belong to DeAndre now. As the door clicked shut behind them, leaving me in deafening silence, I sank to the hardwood floor, my chest heaving with violent, silent sobs. I reached into my desk drawer for my emergency spare phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I desperately needed Jamal. I needed him to tell me we could run away together. But as I frantically dialed his familiar number, I had no idea that the brutal betrayal I had just experienced from my mother was absolutely nothing compared to the nightmare that was waiting for me next. The phone rang 5 times before going straight to voicemail. I tried again, but the automated voice told me the subscriber was unavailable. Panic gripped my chest, tightening my lungs until I could barely breathe. I shoved my feet into my sneakers, grabbed my car keys, and ran out the door. The drive to Jamal's apartment usually took 20 minutes, but I made it in 10. I ignored the speed limits and ran 2 yellow lights. My mind was racing with plans of packing our bags and driving across the state lines where my mother and sister could never find us. Jamal and I had been together since we were 23. We had survived long periods of unemployment, terrible landlords, and endless struggles. I had audited extra medical bills late into the night just to pay his portion of the rent when he was out of work. He was my safe place, my only escape from the toxic environment of my family. I knew he would protect me. When I reached his apartment complex, I sprinted up the 3 flights of concrete stairs. I noticed the front door of his unit was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and froze in the doorway, unable to process what I was looking at. The small living room we had spent 5 years painting and decorating together was covered in cardboard boxes. Our framed photos were tossed carelessly into a trash bag. Jamal was standing by the worn-out sofa, forcefully shoving his clothes and his expensive sneaker collection into a large black suitcase. "Jamal," I gasped, stepping into the room. "What are you doing? We have to leave right now. My mother was just at my house, and she is trying to force me to marry someone." He did not drop the clothes. He did not rush to comfort me or pull me into his arms. Instead, he let out a heavy sigh and refused to look me in the eye. He slowly zipped up the front pocket of his suitcase and crossed his arms over his chest. "Renee, you need to go home," he said. His voice was completely flat. There was no warmth, no shock, no concern. "Go home?" I asked, my voice trembling as I stepped closer to him. "Did you not hear what I just said? My family is selling me off to some wealthy family in Atlanta because Garrett is bankrupt. They want me to marry a paralyzed man for $200,000. We need to get in the car and leave this city tonight." Jamal finally looked at me, and the cold, calculating look in his eyes made my stomach drop all the way to the floor. "I know, Renee," he said plainly. Your mother called me this morning. She told me all about the arrangement. The room suddenly felt like it was spinning out of control. You knew, I whispered, stumbling backward. You knew, and you did not even try to warn me. Warn you about what? Jamal scoffed, turning his back to me to grab another stack of folded shirts. Warn you that you finally have a chance to be rich. Let us be real for a second, Renee. We have been together for 5 years, and what do we have to show for it? You audit hospital bills for pennies and I sell phones at the mall. We are barely scraping by every single month. Your mother is offering you a massive mansion and a limitless black card. You would be an absolute fool to turn that down. I stared at the man I had loved unconditionally for 5 years. The man I had cooked for and cleaned for and supported without question. He was talking about my life and my physical body as if it were a cheap business transaction. I do not care about a mansion, Jamal. I cried, wiping the tears from my face. I care about you. I thought we were going to get married. I thought we were building a future together. A future on what budget? He fired back, stepping closer to me with a sneer on his face. Love does not pay the rent, Renee. Love does not buy a house or a luxury car. I am tired of being broke. I am tired of watching your sister drive around in a Mercedes while we have to clip coupons for groceries. This is your way out. And honestly, it is my way out too. What do you mean it is your way out? I asked, feeling a cold dread wash over me. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before his face hardened completely. It does not matter, he snapped, waving his hand dismissively. What matters is that we are done. You need to go play nurse for the wheelchair guy, and I need a fresh start. I am moving out of state today. He grabbed my upper arm and practically dragged me toward the front door. You cannot do this, I pleaded, struggling against his surprisingly strong grip. You are the only person I have left, Jamal. Please do not abandon me like this. I love you. You were always a heavy burden, Renee, he muttered, pushing me out into the brightly lit hallway. Always whining about your family drama, but never doing anything to elevate yourself. Now someone is handing you a winning lottery ticket, and you are standing here crying about it. Go sign the papers and leave me alone. The heavy wooden door slammed shut right in my face. The metallic click of the deadbolt locking echoed loudly in the empty hallway. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the scratched wood of his apartment door. The person I trusted most in the entire world had just discarded me like garbage because the prospect of me getting rich was more appealing to him than our 5 years of loyalty. My heart did not just break, it completely shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. I dragged myself down the concrete stairs and got back into my car. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, but I had absolutely nowhere to drive. My mother had effectively cut me off from every family member. My boyfriend had thrown me out like yesterday trash. I was entirely alone in the world. The isolation was so heavy it felt like someone was sitting on my chest, suffocating me. I drove back to my apartment complex on autopilot, my vision completely blurred by endless tears. When I pulled into the parking lot, I saw a sleek black town car waiting right outside my building. A tall man in a dark tailored suit was standing by the hood holding a thick leather folder. I parked my car and walked toward him, feeling like a prisoner, walking toward the executioner block. The man did not greet me or offer any sympathy. He simply opened the folder and handed me a heavy metal pen. The prenuptial agreement and the marriage certificate, miss, he said, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. Your mother said you would be ready to sign them upon your return. I looked down at the thick stack of legal documents. The name DeAndre was printed in bold black letters next to a blank line reserved for my signature. The pages clearly outlined how I would receive 0 assets in the event of a divorce. It dictated that my primary residence would be his family estate, and my primary role would be his caretaker. It was not a marriage certificate at all. It was a detailed receipt of purchase. I thought about my mother threatening to leave me homeless and destroy my reputation in our community. I thought about Jamal telling me I was a burden and slamming the door in my face. I had no money, no support system, and no fight left in my exhausted body. The people who were supposed to love and protect me had pushed me right off the edge of a cliff. Hot tears dripped from my chin and splashed onto the crisp white paper, blurring the black ink. My hand shook violently as I pressed the tip of the pen to the paper. I signed my name, sealing my cruel fate, and signing my entire life away to a man I had never even met. The driver immediately took the folder back, nodded once, and opened the back door of the town car for me. I climbed into the cold leather seat, leaving my old life behind, and drove off into the absolute darkest chapter of my existence. The drive to the Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta took almost an hour, but to me, it felt exactly like a slow funeral procession. The sleek town car glided silently through massive wrought iron gates and rolled up a long, meticulously paved circular driveway before stopping in front of a sprawling modern mansion. It was a monolithic structure made of cold gray stone and massive walls of tinted glass, looking much more like a high-security corporate fortress than a welcoming family home. The driver quickly retrieved my single cheap fabric suitcase from the trunk, set it on the massive stone porch, and drove away without uttering a single word of comfort or explanation. I stood there alone, shivering in the cool evening air before pushing the heavy double doors open. The inside of the house was absolutely freezing. The air conditioning must have been turned down so low it instantly raised goosebumps all over my bare arms. The grand foyer was entirely white marble with harsh recessed lighting that offered no shadows to hide in. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing weakly off the soaring high ceilings. There was no answer, just the hollow sound of my own desperation bouncing back at me. I gripped the handle of my suitcase and slowly dragged it into the massive sunken living room. That is when I heard the low, steady mechanical hum of a motorized wheelchair. Out of the deep shadows of an adjoining hallway emerged a man. He was tall, even seated, with broad, athletic shoulders and a sharp jawline covered in a dark, heavy shadow of stubble. But his eyes were what immediately caught and held my attention. They were dead, completely empty of any light or warmth or basic human kindness. This was DeAndre. "So you are the new babysitter," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sneer that cut right through the quiet room. His words dripped with absolute venom and contempt. "I am your wife," I whispered, my voice trembling uncontrollably as I stood paralyzed next to my beaten-up suitcase. "Wife." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the bare walls and made me flinch. "You are a purchased employee, Renee. Do not ever confuse the two. My parents bought you to wipe my mouth and push this chair around so they do not have to look at their broken son every day." He rolled his chair closer to a sleek glass bar cart, holding a heavy crystal decanter and a half-empty glass of amber liquid. "I did not want this either," I said, taking a cautious step back as he approached. "My family forced me into this arrangement. My mother needed the money to save my brother-in-law from going bankrupt." He aggressively grabbed the crystal glass from the cart, his knuckles turning white. "Oh, please spare me the pathetic victim routine," he spat, glaring at me with pure hatred. "Everyone has a price, and yours was just exceptionally cheap. You gold-digging parasites are all exactly the same. You will say whatever you need to say to justify cashing that check." Without any warning, he hurled the heavy crystal glass right at the stone wall next to my head. It shattered upon impact into 100 jagged pieces, sending dangerously sharp fragments skittering across the pristine marble floor. I gasped, flinching hard and covering my face with my arms as the glass rained down around my shoes. DeAndre then grabbed a thick leather folder from his lap. It looked exactly like the prenuptial agreement I had signed earlier today in the parking lot. He threw it violently across the room and it landed with a heavy smack near my feet, pages spilling out and sliding across the polished floor. "Here are your house rules," he snarled, gripping the armrests of his chair. "Read them carefully. You stay out of my way at all times. You do not speak to me unless I speak to you first. You sleep in the empty guest room at the end of the East Wing hallway, and you never ever come into my personal space. Welcome to your new luxury mansion, sweetheart." He aggressively spun his wheelchair around and disappeared down the dark hallway, leaving me completely alone in the massive freezing room. My chest heaved as I dropped to my knees on the cold floor. I was exhausted, deeply traumatized, and entirely broken, but my practical instincts kicked in. I knew I could not leave dangerous shards of glass scattered across the walkway of a man confined to a wheelchair, no matter how cruel he had just been to me. I crawled on my hands and knees, carefully picking up the sharp pieces of crystal one by one and placing them into a small, neat pile. My fingers were trembling so badly I accidentally nicked my thumb, but I ignored the sting. As I reached for the scattered pages of the agreement that had slid across the floor, a small folded piece of paper slipped out from between the heavy legal documents. It was not printed on the thick, expensive legal stationery like the rest of the contract. It looked like a standard banking printout that had been carelessly shoved into the folder at the last minute. I picked it up intending to just shove it back into the leather binder, but my eyes instantly caught the bold black numbers printed right at the top. $200,000. It was a wire transfer receipt dated exactly 3 days ago. The transaction was vaguely marked as an anonymous private care grant. I scanned the document, feeling a strange, overwhelming sense of confusion. My mother and my sister had explicitly told me DeAndre's parents had paid the massive sum of money to secure my services. But as I looked closely at the sender information printed on the receipt, my heart stopped completely. The money had not come from the grand estate of DeAndre family. The sender was clearly listed as Apex Horizon Holdings. I knew that name. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. My brother-in-law Garrett had aggressively bragged about Apex Horizon Holdings at our Thanksgiving dinner last year. It was a private shell company he had set up to manage the offshore assets for his tech startup. My hands shook so violently, the thin paper rattled loudly in the quiet room. I sat back on my heels, the intense cold of the marble floor seeping deep into my bones. Garrett had paid the $200,000. My brother-in-law, whose startup was supposedly completely bankrupt, had somehow entirely funded my forced marriage. He had used his own hidden shell company to buy me and trap me in this isolated mansion with a hostile, paralyzed man. A chilling wave of pure dread washed over my entire body, paralyzing my lungs. Why would Garrett pay an absolute fortune to force me into a fake marriage with a wealthy heir? Garrett was arrogant and dismissive, and he barely even spoke to me at family gatherings. He viewed me as a peasant. What possible connection could my shady brother-in-law have with this wealthy, crippled man in Atlanta? I stared down the long, dark, empty hallway where DeAndre had disappeared, realizing with absolute freezing terror that I was not just sold to a rich family to be a glorified nurse. I was an unwitting pawn in a very sick and dangerous game, and Garrett was the one moving the pieces from the shadows. 1 entire year had passed since the heavy oak doors of the mansion had closed behind me, trapping me in a cold and loveless arrangement. My life had settled into a silent, isolating routine. DeAndre and I lived like two ghosts, haunting the exact same house, but never actually crossing paths. I stayed in the East Wing just as he had demanded. I audited medical bills remotely from my laptop, taking on extra freelance work, just to keep my mind occupied and save whatever small change I could. I made sure his dietary meals were prepared and his medical supplies were fully stocked, but I stayed completely out of his way. And every single day, the secret knowledge of that wire transfer from Garrett ate away at my insides like a slow-acting poison. I had not said a word to DeAndre about it. I had no idea who was truly playing who, and I was absolutely terrified that if I spoke up, Garrett would somehow find a way to destroy me even further. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when my quiet prison was suddenly breached. I was standing in the massive gourmet kitchen, pouring myself a cup of dark roast coffee, when I heard a loud commotion coming from the grand foyer. Angry voices echoed off the marble floors, followed by the heavy thud of the front doors slamming open. I walked out of the kitchen holding my warm ceramic mug and froze. My mother Vera, my sister Monique, and my brother-in-law Garrett were standing right in the middle of the living room, dripping wet from the rain and glaring at the expensive modern art on the walls. They had shoved right past the estate security guard, who was nervously hovering in the doorway. "Look at this place!" Garrett whistled loudly, running his hand over a custom velvet sofa. "It is like a damn museum. Not bad for a guy who cannot even walk up his own stairs." "What are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice shaking as I gripped my coffee mug. "You cannot just barge into this house." Vera rolled her eyes and crossed her arms over her damp designer trench coat. "Do not use that tone with me, Renee. We are family and we came to check on our investment. You have been ignoring my text messages for 3 months." "I have nothing to say to you," I replied, staring coldly at the woman who had sold me. "Well, you are going to listen to us today?" Monique snapped, stepping forward and pointing her sharp acrylic nail at my chest. "Garrett needs another capital injection. His startup is expanding into a new market, and the investors are delaying their payouts. You need to go into your little crippled husband bank accounts and wire us $50,000 by the end of the day." I stared at them in absolute disbelief. My heart pounded violently against my ribs. "You want more money?" I asked, my voice rising. "Garrett already paid $200,000 to orchestrate this entire nightmare. Why are you coming here to extort more?" Garrett's face went completely rigid. His eyes darted toward Vera and Monique, who both looked genuinely confused. He quickly stepped between me and my sister, his jaw clenched tight. "Shut your mouth!" Renee, Garrett hissed, stepping uncomfortably close to me. "You do not know what you are talking about. You are going to get us that money, or I swear to God, I will make sure the prenuptial agreement is voided and you are thrown out on the street with absolutely nothing." "What is going on out here?" A deep, furious voice echoed from the hallway. The motorized hum of a wheelchair grew louder as DeAndre rolled out from the shadows of the West Wing. He looked exhausted. Dark circles lined his eyes and his jaw was covered in thick stubble. He glared at the three intruders with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Who let this trash into my home?" DeAndre demanded, stopping his chair a few feet away from us. "Get out before I have security physically drag you to the curb." Garrett puffed out his chest, his arrogance completely taking over. He took a step toward DeAndre, looking down at him with a sickening smirk. "Relax, buddy," Garrett mocked. "We are just here visiting family. Your little hired nurse owes us a favor. You have millions sitting in the bank doing absolutely nothing while you rot in that chair. We just need a small loan. Consider it a convenience fee for taking her off our hands." DeAndre's hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair so tightly his knuckles turned pure white. "You have exactly 10 seconds to leave my property before I call the police." DeAndre warned, his voice dangerously low. Garrett let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. "What are you going to do about it, you pathetic cripple? You cannot even stand up to defend your own house." The word cripple hung in the air like a physical blow. I saw the flash of deep humiliation and helpless rage cross DeAndre's face, and something inside of me violently snapped. A year of pent-up anger, a year of being treated like garbage, a year of sitting in silence while these monsters ruined my life, all boiled over in one single blinding second. I did not even think. I stepped right in front of DeAndre, putting my body between his wheelchair and my arrogant brother-in-law. With one swift motion, I swung my arm and threw the entire mug of freshly brewed piping hot coffee directly onto Garrett's chest. The hot brown liquid splashed violently against his expensive white designer shirt, soaking through to his skin. Garrett let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek and stumbled backward, frantically pulling the burning fabric away from his chest. "Are you insane?" Monique screamed, rushing to her husband's side. She turned to me, her face twisted in absolute fury. "Look what you did to him! Get out of my house!" I screamed back, my voice echoing off the high ceilings with a fierce, terrifying authority I did not even know I possessed. Renee Vera gasped, clutching her chest in fake horror. "How dare you assault family like this? We are your blood." "You are nothing to me," I growled, stepping forward and forcing them to back up toward the front door. "You sold me like a piece of meat. You lied to me. And you, Garrett?" I pointed my empty ceramic mug right at his face. "You are a pathetic, desperate fraud. If any of you ever step foot on this property again, I will call the police and I will personally press charges for trespassing and extortion. Now get out." Garrett was still cursing and clutching his red, scalded chest. Monique was practically dragging him toward the door while Vera glared at me with pure venom. "You are going to regret this, Renee," Vera spat before turning on her heel. I slammed the heavy oak double doors right behind them, locking the deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click. The silence of the house came rushing back in, but my chest was heaving and my hands were shaking violently. I stood there staring at the wooden door, half expecting them to start pounding on the glass. I slowly turned around, terrified of the reaction I was going to get from my cold, hostile husband. DeAndre was sitting in his wheelchair right where I had left him. He was not glaring at me. He was not yelling about the coffee stains splashed across his expensive marble floor. He was looking up at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. The thick walls of ice and resentment that usually hardened his features had completely melted away. He looked at my shaking hands and then up to my tear-filled eyes. There was no contempt in his gaze anymore. Instead, he was looking at me with absolute, profound respect. For an entire year, we had been enemies trapped in the same cage. But as we stared at each other in the quiet aftermath of the chaos, the heavy air between us completely shifted. He finally saw that I was not just a gold digger bought and paid for by his family. I was a survivor, and I had just gone to war to defend him. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice incredibly soft, almost a whisper. "Because they have taken enough from both of us," I replied, wiping a rogue tear from my cheek. DeAndre slowly rolled his chair a few inches closer to me. He looked down at the floor and took a deep, trembling breath. "Come into my office, Renee," he said, looking back up at me with a fierce, burning intensity in his dark eyes. "There are some things you need to see." I followed the soft hum of his wheelchair down the dark mahogany hallway. My heart was still racing from the adrenaline of throwing that coffee, but a new kind of nervous energy was quickly taking over. DeAndre stopped in front of a heavy wooden door at the very end of the west wing. He punched a code into the digital keypad, and the door clicked open. I stepped inside and my breath caught in my throat. This was not just a home office. It looked like a frantic war room. The massive walls were covered in whiteboards pinned with police reports, photographs of a mangled car, and endless handwritten timelines. The large oak desk in the center of the room was completely buried under towering stacks of medical files, hospital bills, insurance claims, and legal documents. "Close the door, Renee," he said quietly, rolling over to the desk. I shut the heavy door behind me and walked closer, my eyes scanning the chaotic room. "What is all this?" I asked softly. "This is my life for the past 2 years," he replied, gesturing to the mountains of paper. "The police ruled my car accident a tragic mechanical malfunction. They said the brakes on my car just happened to fail on a steep, winding road late at night. My parents accepted that explanation, and they accepted the doctor's prognosis that I would never walk again. But I know what I felt that night. My car was tampered with before I even left the parking lot. Someone wanted me dead. And when I miraculously survived, they made sure I was trapped in this chair." I stared at him, absorbing the heavy weight of his words. The idea that someone had intentionally tried to murder him was terrifying, but looking at the intense determination in his eyes, I knew he was not crazy. "But who would want to do that?" I asked, taking a step closer to the desk. "That is what I have been trying to prove," he said, dragging a thick black binder across the polished wood. "I have had private investigators quietly looking into the crash, but the trail is completely cold. Whoever did this covered their tracks perfectly. However, there is something else, something I cannot figure out because I do not understand the complicated medical bureaucracy. I know you work as a medical billing auditor. I have seen you working on your laptop in the dining room late at night. I need you to look at my hospital records." He pushed the heavy binder toward me. "Something is very wrong with my treatment, Renee," he continued, his voice thick with frustration. "My legs are completely numb, heavy like lead bags. But sometimes late at night I get these sharp shooting pains down my calves. Severe muscle spasms that the doctors tell me are just phantom reflexes from a dead nervous system." My lead neurologist, Dr. Vance, insists my spine is completely severed and keeps upping my daily medication to manage the pain. But my gut tells me he is lying to me. I pulled out the plush leather chair opposite his desk and sat down. For the first time since we met, we were not enemies. We were two people trapped in a terrifying web of lies trying to find a way out. I opened the thick binder and immediately went to work. My eyes scanned the familiar stark white pages of hospital invoices, insurance claim forms, and diagnostic reports. The medical billing codes were a second language to me. I spent my entire career catching fraudulent charges and uncovering billing discrepancies. I traced my finger down the very first emergency room admission document from the night of his crash. Look at this! I pointed to a sequence of numbers on the page. These are ICD-10 codes. The initial trauma surgeon in the emergency room coded your injury as a severe spinal contusion. That means there was massive swelling and deep bruising around your spinal cord, but not a complete break. The prognosis code right next to it suggests a long physical therapy rehabilitation plan. They fully expected you to walk again. DeAndre wheeled closer, leaning over the desk to look at where my finger was pointing. But Dr. Vance told my parents my spine was entirely severed, he said, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He told them that physical therapy would be a complete waste of time and money and would only cause me more physical agony. I turned the page quickly, comparing the initial emergency room bill to the first invoice from Dr. Vance, who abruptly took over the case 2 days later. My stomach completely dropped as I read the modified codes. The alphanumeric sequences glared back at me, telling a terrifying story of medical malpractice. DeAndre, I whispered, looking up at him. Dr. Vance changed your diagnostic codes. 2 days after your accident, he submitted an entirely new claim to the insurance company, deliberately overriding the emergency room trauma report. He used a specific modifier code to upcode the severity of your injury to a complete spinal cord transection. What does that actually mean? He asked, his voice tight with rising panic. It means he intentionally altered your official medical record to make your condition look permanent to the insurance company and your family, I explained, feeling a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. And it gets much worse. Let me see your pharmacy invoices right now. He quickly handed me a separate file folder filled with monthly prescription bills and pharmacy receipts. I flipped through them, my heart pounding against my ribs as I read the specific chemical names and dosages of the medications he was taking every single day. Dr. Vance had him on a massive daily dose of a highly potent synthetic nerve depressant. It was a heavy, specialized drug normally used only in extreme cases of neurological disease to completely suppress muscle spasms and shut down nerve endings. DeAndre, these pills you take every single day, I said, holding up the pharmacy bill so he could see the highlighted charges. They are not just for pain management like he told you. This is a massive dose of a chemical nerve block. This medication is actively suppressing your central nervous system. It is chemically keeping your legs numb and paralyzed. He is not treating you, DeAndre. He is chemically restraining you. The silence in the room was absolutely deafening. DeAndre stared at the piece of paper in my trembling hand. His broad chest rose and fell rapidly as the horrifying reality of what I was saying washed over him. The doctor, his wealthy family trusted unconditionally. The man who had been coming to this house every single month to warmly check on his progress was intentionally keeping him paralyzed and confined to a wheelchair. But why? DeAndre finally choked out his voice, breaking with a volatile mixture of profound grief and boiling rage. Why would a highly respected neurologist risk his entire medical license and face federal prison just to keep me in a wheelchair? I thought back to the crumpled wire transfer receipt I had found on my very first night in this house. The $200,000 paid to my desperate mother by my arrogant brother-in-law, Garrett. Garrett, who had just stood in our living room mocking DeAndre and calling him a cripple with a sickening smirk on his face. Garrett, who somehow had the power and the money to orchestrate my forced marriage. DeAndre, I said slowly, closing the heavy binder and looking him directly in the eyes. I think Garrett paid him. I think Garrett paid my mother to force me into this house to keep a close eye on you. And I think he is paying Dr. Vance to keep you disabled so you can never stand up and fight back. DeAndre's eyes widened in pure shock before narrowing into two dark, dangerous slits. He looked down at his muscular but useless legs and then slowly back up at me. The quiet vulnerability from earlier was completely gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying resolve that sent a shiver down my spine. "We are going to find out exactly what Dr. Vance is hiding," he stated plainly, his voice low and lethal. "And then Renee. We are going to burn all of them to the ground." The next morning, DeAndre and I formulated a desperate plan. Dr. Vance was scheduled for his weekly house visit on Thursday, but we needed concrete answers before he ever stepped foot inside the mansion again. I knew from reviewing his endless medical billing files that he operated a highly exclusive private neurology clinic in downtown Atlanta. If Garrett was paying him off to commit severe medical malpractice, there had to be a physical money trail. Garrett was far too smart to leave a digital footprint for something as highly illegal as bribing a physician to medically paralyze a man. It had to be an untraceable cash exchange. DeAndre gave me the keys to an old dusty sedan that belonged to one of his former groundskeepers. It was a faded gray color, completely inconspicuous, and practically invisible on the busy city streets. I tied my hair back, put on a pair of dark sunglasses, and drove into the heart of the city. I parked across the street from the sleek glass building of Dr. Vance's private clinic and waited. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my palms were sweating profusely. I sat there in the suffocating heat of the car for 3 grueling hours, watching wealthy, oblivious patients come and go through the heavy glass doors. My mind raced with terrifying scenarios. What if Dr. Vance recognized me? What if Garrett had people watching the clinic? Finally, at exactly 5:15, Dr. Vance walked out. He was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carrying a heavy leather briefcase, looking exactly like the respectable medical professional everyone believed him to be. He confidently climbed into a shiny black luxury SUV and pulled out into the heavy evening traffic. I started the engine and carefully pulled out into the street. I kept 2 cars between us, just like I had seen in the movies, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. The drive took us away from the polished high-rises of the commercial district and toward the older, crumbling industrial side of the city. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the cracked pavement and abandoned warehouses. The entire atmosphere felt heavy and dangerous. Dr. Vance turned his heavy vehicle into a dimly lit multi-level concrete parking garage that looked like it had not been maintained in over a decade. I waited a few agonizing seconds before turning in after him. The garage was almost completely empty, the stagnant air smelling strongly of damp concrete and old motor oil. I turned my headlights off, relying solely on the sparse fluorescent tubes flickering weakly overhead. I watched as his bright red brake lights illuminated the 3rd-level ramp. I parked my car a level below and quietly crept up the cold concrete stairs, my breath catching painfully in my throat with every single echo of my sneakers against the steps. I pushed the heavy metal stairwell door open just a tiny crack and peered out onto the 3rd level. Dr. Vance was standing outside his vehicle, his expensive briefcase resting on the hood. He kept checking his gold watch, clearly agitated and anxious to get this meeting over with. A few moments later, a dark, sleek sedan slowly rolled up the ramp and parked just a few empty spaces away. The engine cut off and the driver door opened. I strained my eyes in the dim yellow light, trying desperately to get a good look at the man stepping out. He was wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over his head, obscuring his features, and he was carrying a thick brown manila envelope tucked tightly under his arm. He walked directly over to Dr. Vance. They did not shake hands or exchange any pleasantries. The body language was incredibly tense and hurried. The man in the hoodie shoved the thick envelope directly into the doctor chest. Dr. Vance opened the flap, and even from my hiding spot I could clearly see the thick stacks of $100 bills neatly bound inside. The doctor nodded quickly, tossed the envelope into his briefcase, and immediately got back into his luxury SUV without saying a single word. As the doctor sped away, the tires screeching slightly on the slick concrete, The man in the hoodie stood there for a moment in the empty garage. He let out a long breath, reached up and pulled the dark hood back, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. He turned his head to walk back to his car, catching the harsh glare of a flickering overhead fluorescent light. My heart completely stopped beating. The solid concrete floor seemed to vanish right from beneath my feet, and all the oxygen was violently sucked out of my lungs. It was Jamal. I clamped both of my hands over my mouth to violently muffle the loud, terrified gasp that tried to tear its way out of my throat. My knees buckled beneath me, and I slumped against the heavy metal door, the rough steel biting sharply into my shoulder. My mind fractured into 1,000 chaotic pieces, completely unable to process the impossible image my own eyes had just registered. Jamal. The man I had loved unconditionally for 5 grueling years. The man who had cooked cheap dinners with me in our tiny apartment. The man who had promised to build a beautiful future with me against all odds. The man who had brutally kicked me out of his apartment and told me I was a heavy burden just so he could get a fresh start. He was the bagman. My brain scrambled frantically to connect the horrifying dots. When my mother had forced me to marry DeAndre, Jamal had not been shocked or devastated. He had known about the sick arrangement before I even arrived at his apartment that day. He had looked me in the eye and told me it was his way out too. I had naively assumed he just meant he was finally free of my constant family drama and my financial struggles. But this was what he actually meant. He was not just a pathetic coward who abandoned me for an easier life. He was actively involved in my nightmare. But exactly how deep did this twisted betrayal go? Garrett was the mastermind behind DeAndre Paralyzed State, and Garrett was the one who had bought me for $200,000 to act as a silent spy. Dr. Vance was the medical executioner, keeping DeAndre confined to that wheelchair with toxic chemicals. And Jamal, my supposedly broke retail working boyfriend, was the trusted middleman delivering the massive bribe money between them. I watched through the narrow crack in the door as Jamal casually pulled a set of car keys from his pocket. He was not driving his old busted sedan anymore. He unlocked the brand new dark sports car, the headlights flashing brightly in the empty garage. He climbed into the expensive leather seat and drove away, leaving me completely paralyzed in the cold shadows. Hot, angry tears streamed down my face, burning my cold skin. My own mother and sister had sold me out of pure greed, but Jamal had sold me out of calculated malice. He had looked me directly in the eye while my heart was breaking into pieces and pushed me right into a terrifying trap he had helped build. As I slowly forced myself to stand up and walk back down the concrete stairs to my borrowed car, a new, much darker question began to form in my mind. Garrett was a wealthy, arrogant tech executive with endless high-profile connections. Why in the world would he ever choose a retail worker like Jamal to handle his highly illegal cash deliveries? Unless Jamal was not just a random messenger. Unless Jamal was somehow directly connected to the night the brakes on DeAndre's car were mysteriously cut. I gripped the steering wheel of the old sedan, my entire body shaking with a terrifying new rage. I was going to rip the truth out of him no matter what it took. The drive back to the mansion was a blur of neon streetlights and blinding rage. I burst through the heavy front doors and found DeAndre waiting for me in his office. I told him everything. I told him about the parking garage, the envelope of cash, and the sickening realization that my ex-boyfriend Jamal was the bagman. DeAndre listened in absolute silence. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth would shatter. We both knew we had stumbled into something far bigger and much more dangerous than a simple case of medical malpractice. We needed hard proof. We needed a professional who could dig through Garrett's encrypted digital footprint without tipping him off. The very next morning, DeAndre reached out to a former intelligence officer turned private investigator named Marcus. Marcus was incredibly expensive and operated entirely in the shadows. We gave him everything we had. The name of Garrett's shell company Apex Horizon Holdings, the medical billing records, Dr. Vance license plate number, and Jamal full name. Marcus took the files, nodded once, and vanished. The next 3 weeks were pure, agonizing torture. DeAndre and I spent our days pretending everything was normal, acting the part of the miserable, crippled husband and his silent, trapped wife, just in case Garrett was having us watched. But late at night, in the safety of his office, we plotted. We became a team, united by a deep, burning desire for absolute destruction. Finally, late on a rainy Thursday night, Marcus slipped through the back service entrance of the estate. He walked into the office shaking the rain from his dark coat and dropped a massive, thick, leather-bound dossier right onto DeAndre's desk. It was over 500 pages of bank statements, wire transfers, phone records, and encrypted emails. Marcus did not smile. He looked at both of us with a grim, heavy expression and told us to sit down. I opened the heavy folder and the entire horrifying puzzle finally snapped into place. Garrett was not just an arrogant brother-in-law who ran a failing tech startup. 2 years ago, Garrett's startup had received a massive round of seed funding, and his primary angel investor was DeAndre. They were silent business partners, but Garrett was incredibly greedy. Marcus had uncovered a complex web of offshore accounts, proving that Garrett had been quietly embezzling millions of dollars from the company and funneling the stolen money straight into his shell company Apex Horizon Holdings. DeAndre's hands shook as he read the printed emails. I knew, he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. I found irregularities in our accounting just days before my accident. I confronted Garrett and told him I was going to the federal authorities the next morning to expose everything. That is why he did it. I turned the page and my blood ran completely cold. The police report from DeAndre's accident had stated the brake lines on his sports car simply failed due to a mechanical defect. But Marcus had pulled the security footage from the parking garage where DeAndre worked. The footage was grainy, but it clearly showed a man in a dark hoodie sliding underneath DeAndre's car holding a pair of heavy wire cutters. Marcus had enhanced the facial recognition. It was Jamal. The air was violently sucked out of the room. Jamal was not just a retail worker who delivered bribes. Before we met, Jamal had worked as a junior mechanic at a luxury auto shop. He knew exactly how to sever a brake line without making it look like obvious sabotage. Garrett had paid Jamal $50,000 to permanently silence his business partner. But DeAndre miraculously survived the horrific crash. When DeAndre woke up in the hospital, Garrett completely panicked. If DeAndre recovered and regained his memory, he would expose the massive embezzlement and the attempted murder. Garrett desperately needed a failsafe. Marcus pointed to the massive bank transfers from Apex Horizon Holdings. Garrett used the stolen money to bribe Dr. Vance to prescribe the heavy nerve depressants, keeping DeAndre chemically paralyzed and trapped in a wheelchair so he could never physically make it to a courtroom. But Garrett was still deeply paranoid. He needed a spy inside the house to monitor DeAndre every single move and report back if DeAndre ever started asking questions or remembering the crash. That is exactly where I came in. Garrett knew my mother Vera was incredibly greedy and completely desperate to keep up appearances. He knew I was dating his hired hitman Jamal, so Garrett orchestrated the sickest manipulation of all. He offered my mother $200,000 to force me into marrying DeAndre, knowing I would be the perfect, terrified, obedient spy. Garrett ordered Jamal to abruptly break my heart and kick me out onto the street so I would have absolutely nowhere else to go. My entire life, my brutal heartbreak, my forced marriage, my isolated prison, it was all meticulously designed and fully funded by my own brother-in-law, just to cover up his corporate theft. I slammed the heavy dossier shut, the loud thud echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. The sheer scale of the evil we were looking at was almost impossible to comprehend. My own sister was married to a man who tried to murder my husband and then bought me as a human security camera. My mother traded my freedom for a fast payout. My boyfriend tried to kill a man and sold me into slavery for a brand new sports car. I looked over at DeAndre. He was staring blankly at the wall, the profound betrayal of his closest business partner weighing heavily on his broad shoulders. We had all the evidence we needed to send every single one of them to federal prison for the rest of their miserable lives. But quietly handing these files over to the police was not going to be enough. I reached across the wide desk and gently placed my hand over DeAndre's trembling fist. He looked at me, his dark eyes shining with a lethal, terrifying clarity. "Garrett thinks he has won," I whispered, my voice completely steady. "He thinks you are a broken cripple, and he thinks I am a pathetic pawn. Let him keep thinking that. Garrett is filing the legal paperwork to take his tech company public next month." DeAndre slowly nodded, a dark, dangerous smile spreading across his handsome face. "We are going to let him build his beautiful glass castle," DeAndre replied softly, gripping my hand tightly. "And then we are going to shatter it right in his face, while the entire world watches." The very next day, I put the first phase of our plan into motion. Marcus had included Jamal's current phone number in the thick dossier. I bought a cheap burner phone from a small gas station down the street so Garrett could not possibly track the call, and I dialed the number. My hands were shaking violently, but I forced myself to take a deep breath and channel every single ounce of my fear into pure adrenaline. Jamal picked up on the third ring. His voice was exactly the same, smooth and sickeningly arrogant. "Jamal, it is Renee," I said, my voice trembling intentionally, making myself sound absolutely terrified and desperate. "Please do not hang up. I need your help right now." "Renee?" He sighed, sounding immediately annoyed and inconvenienced. "How did you get this number? I told you a year ago. We are done. Do not ever call me again." I know, I sobbed, forcing fake tears into my voice. "But you are in terrible danger, Jamal. DeAndre hired a private investigator. I was cleaning his home office this morning and I found a massive file sitting on his desk. Your name is in it, Jamal. There are clear photographs of you at the hospital parking garage handing envelopes of cash to Dr. Vance." The line went dead silent. The obnoxious arrogance completely vanished from his voice in a split second. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded, his tone dropping into a frantic, panicked whisper. "I think Garrett is setting you up," I whispered back, looking over at DeAndre, who was sitting across the desk, nodding silently. "The file says Garrett is planning to tell the police that you acted entirely alone, that you cut the brakes because you were jealous of DeAndre's wealth, and that you are the one extorting the doctor for prescription drugs. Jamal, you have to meet me so I can show you copies of these legal documents before they go directly to the federal police." He swallowed so hard I could actually hear it through the tiny phone speaker. "Where do you want to meet?" he asked, his voice cracking with fear. An hour later, I pulled the old, dusty sedan into the parking lot of a rundown diner on the far industrial side of town. The broken neon sign buzzed loudly in the damp night air, casting a harsh, flickering red glow over the empty, cracked asphalt. My emergency phone was sitting at the very top of my open purse, with the voice memo app currently recording every single sound in the room. I sat in a sticky vinyl booth near the back facing the entrance. 10 minutes later, Jamal rushed through the glass doors. He was wearing an expensive leather jacket clearly bought with his blood money, and his eyes were darting around the empty diner like a terrified, cornered animal. He slid into the booth across from me, his hands fidgeting nervously on the table. "Where are the papers?" he demanded, keeping his voice incredibly low and urgent. "Show me the file, Renee." I leaned forward, staring right into the eyes of the man who had completely destroyed my heart and my entire life. "I did not bring them," I lied smoothly, my face a perfect mask of absolute panic. "I could not sneak them out of the mansion, but I read every single page, Jamal. Garrett is going to throw you under the bus. He is about to take his tech company public next month, and he desperately needs to clean up his loose ends. He is going to let you take the fall for the attempted murder." Jamal slammed his fist violently against the laminate table. "That arrogant son of a bitch!" he hissed, his face twisting in genuine terror and rage. I knew I could not trust him. I told Garrett $50,000 was not enough to risk a murder charge, but he swore he had the security cameras covered. My heart hammered violently in my chest. The recording app in my purse was capturing everything perfectly. "You actually did it!" I asked, my voice breaking a little as the harsh reality of his vile words fully hit me. You tried to kill an innocent man for $50,000. It was supposed to be a clean job. Jamal fired back defensively, leaning over the table and pointing a finger at me. Garrett told me DeAndre was going to ruin his startup company. He gave me the exact layout of the corporate parking garage and mapped out the security camera blind spots. I just slid under the car, cut the brake lines, and walked away. How was I supposed to know the guy was going to miraculously survive the crash and wake up in the hospital? So Garrett panicked. I pushed gently, guiding the conversation exactly where the police would need it to go. He paid you off to keep quiet. And then what, Jamal? Why were you delivering massive amounts of cash to Dr. Vance in a dark parking garage? Because Garrett is an absolute coward. Jamal spat, wiping a heavy bead of sweat from his forehead. When DeAndre lived, Garrett freaked out. He found out about Dr. Vance, massive underground gambling debts, and realized he could buy the corrupt doctor to keep DeAndre permanently paralyzed. Garrett did not want his own hands dirty, so he made me his personal bagman. I have been dropping off $20,000 in untraceable cash to that doctor every single month just to keep DeAndre drugged out of his mind. I stared at him, feeling absolutely nauseous. The man I had loved unconditionally was a ruthless, soulless monster. And what about me, Jamal? I asked, letting the very real hurt and profound betrayal bleed into my voice. Garrett bought me for $200,000 from my own mother to spy on my husband. Did Garrett pay you to break my heart too? Jamal looked away, completely unable to meet my eyes. Garrett said you were the absolute perfect target, he muttered, looking down at the sticky table. He knew your mother was broke and incredibly greedy. He told me to kick you out and make you feel like you had absolutely nothing left in the world, so you would sign that prenuptial agreement without a single fight. He gave me a cash bonus for getting rid of you quickly. Look, Renee, I am genuinely sorry about how cruel it was, but I needed the money, and you got to live in a luxury mansion. We both won, right? The sheer absolute sociopathy of his statement left me completely breathless. He truly believed he was the tragic victim of Garrett betrayal, completely ignoring the lives he had physically and emotionally destroyed just to buy a brand new sports car. You need to get out of town, Jamal, I said, leaning back in the booth, my voice suddenly very cold and incredibly calm. If Garrett is tying up loose ends, you are the biggest liability he has. Jamal nodded frantically, his eyes wide with blinding fear. You are right, he said, sliding quickly out of the booth. I need to go home and pack my things. I am going to drive down to Florida tonight and lay low until this entire police investigation blows over. Do not tell anyone you saw me tonight, Renee. I will not say a single word, I promised, watching him practically sprint out of the diner and into the dark parking lot. I sat alone in the red glow of the neon sign for a few quiet minutes, listening to the loud screech of his tires as he sped away into the night. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I pressed the red square on the bright screen, stopping the recording. The audio file saved instantly to the cloud. I played back the last critical minute, listening to Jamal clearly confess to the bribery, the attempted murder, and the horrifying manipulation of my forced marriage. His voice was crystal clear against the quiet background of the diner. A slow, triumphant smile spread across my face. Garrett had built a massive empire on lies, betrayal, and innocent blood. He thought he had meticulously covered every single track and bought every single witness. But he made one fatal, catastrophic mistake. He completely underestimated the quiet, obedient girl he bought to be his silent spy. I slipped the phone safely into my coat pocket and walked out into the cool night air, feeling stronger than I had ever felt in my entire life. We finally had the lethal weapon we needed, and it was time to prepare for absolute war. Thanksgiving arrived 2 weeks later, setting the perfect stage for our first major psychological strike. DeAndre and I had spent every single night since the diner carefully analyzing the massive private investigator file. We knew Garrett was incredibly close to taking his tech startup public. The initial public offering, or IPO, was scheduled for the first week of December. If he successfully rang that bell on Wall Street, his stolen millions would be completely legitimized and washed clean. We could not let that happen, but we needed him to make a fatal mistake out of pure panic. DeAndre told me to attend my mother holiday dinner completely alone and play the role of the exhausted, defeated wife. I pulled up to my mother house late Thursday afternoon. The driveway was packed with luxury cars, including Garrett's brand new imported SUV. I walked up the brick path and pushed the front door open, bracing myself for the suffocating hypocrisy. The house smelled like roasted turkey and expensive candles, but the atmosphere was completely toxic. My mother Vera was wearing a pristine silk blouse, pouring expensive wine for Monique, who was lounging on the sofa dripping in new diamonds. "Where is the wheelchair?" my mother asked without even saying hello. Her eyes darted behind me, checking the empty porch. "He was not feeling well today," I lied, keeping my voice soft and submissive. "The pain medication makes him very tired." Monique let out a harsh, unfeeling laugh. "Well, that is probably for the best, Renee. Your house is set up for him, but my dining room is not really wheelchair accessible. Besides, Garrett has some massive news to share, and we do not want any depressing energy ruining the celebration tonight." I forced a weak smile and walked into the dining room. The table was beautifully set with crystal glasses and fine china bought entirely with blood money. A few minutes later, Garrett walked into the room carrying the massive roasted turkey on a silver platter. He looked like a man who believed he owned the entire world. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit and a gold watch that cost more than my entire college education. He took his seat at the head of the table, beaming with pure arrogance. "Let us bow our heads," Garrett announced smoothly, holding his hands out to my mother and sister. "Lord, we thank you for this incredible bounty. We thank you for the massive success of Apex Horizon and the upcoming IPO that will secure our family legacy for generations to come. We also pray for poor DeAndre and ask that you give Renee the strength to carry her heavy burden. Amen." I kept my eyes closed, fighting the intense urge to vomit right onto my fine china plate. The sheer audacity of this man thanking God while actively keeping his business partner chemically paralyzed and stolen from was beyond human comprehension. As we started eating, Garrett completely took over the conversation. He loudly bragged about the Wall Street executives he had been meeting with and the massive valuation his company was about to receive. He talked about buying a private jet and a summer house in the Hamptons. My mother and sister hung on to his every single word, treating him like a literal god who had descended from the heavens to save them all from poverty. "So?" Renee Garrett asked, suddenly pausing with a piece of turkey on his silver fork. "How is the medical billing audit stuff going?" "Still crunching numbers for pennies while the big dogs make the real money." I carefully set my wine glass down on the table. I looked directly at him, my expression completely neutral. "Actually, business has been incredibly busy lately," I said, keeping my voice light and conversational. "The federal government just launched a massive new initiative to crack down on medical billing fraud. I was brought in as a freelance consultant for a huge case right here in Atlanta." Garrett paused. The arrogant smile on his face faltered just a fraction of an inch. "Is that so?" he asked, taking a slow sip of his wine. "Oh yes," I continued, casually cutting a piece of sweet potato. "It is fascinating, really. The IRS and the FBI are working together to investigate a highly exclusive private neurology clinic. Apparently, some corrupt doctors have been intentionally upcoding patient diagnostics to justify prescribing heavy, unnecessary narcotics. But the really interesting part is how they are tracking the bribe money." The entire dining room went dead silent. My mother stopped chewing. Monique looked confused, but Garrett completely froze. The silver fork in his hand hit the china plate with a loud clatter. "What do you mean, tracking the bribe money?" Garrett asked, his voice suddenly lacking all of its previous booming confidence. "Well, the FBI is not stupid," I said, smiling politely at him. "These corrupt doctors were receiving massive cash payouts from anonymous shell companies to keep quiet about the malpractice. But the federal agents found the digital trail connecting the cash withdrawals directly back to the offshore corporate accounts. They are pulling the financial records for dozens of local shell companies as we speak. The lead investigator told me they expect to issue federal arrest warrants for corporate embezzlement and attempted manslaughter by the end of the month. Garrett's face drained of all color. His skin turned a sickening shade of pale gray, and a thick bead of sweat formed right at his temple. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost walk into the room. He grabbed his napkin and violently wiped his mouth, his hands shaking so badly he knocked over his crystal water glass. The cold water spilled all over the expensive linen tablecloth. "Damn it!" Garrett cursed, jumping out of his chair and backing away from the table. "I need to go make a phone call. Excuse me." He practically sprinted out of the dining room, pulling his cell phone out of his pocket with trembling fingers. Monique immediately stood up, looking panicked. "Garrett, honey, what is wrong?" she called out, running after him into the hallway. My mother glared at me across the table. Her eyes narrowed in pure hatred. "Why do you always have to ruin everything, Renee?" she hissed. "He was in a wonderful mood until you started talking about your depressing police work." I slowly stood up from the table, picking up my purse. "I think I'm going to head home now," I said, looking down at her with absolute cold indifference. "Dinner was unforgettable, Mother. Happy Thanksgiving." I walked out the front door, leaving the food completely untouched on my plate. As I walked down the driveway to my car, I could see Garrett pacing frantically on the front porch, screaming into his cell phone and violently running his hands over his head. The absolute sheer panic radiating from his body was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted. The psychological strike had landed perfectly. Garrett was going to completely unravel. I drove back to the Buckhead mansion, the dark city streets slick with cold November rain. The adrenaline was still pumping heavily through my veins when I pulled through the grand iron gates. The massive stone house was completely dark and entirely silent. I locked the front door behind me and walked down the long mahogany hallway toward the west wing. I could not wait to tell DeAndre exactly how Garrett had reacted to the bait. I wanted to see the satisfaction in his eyes. I reached the heavy wooden door of DeAndre's bedroom. It was slightly ajar, spilling a narrow slice of warm yellow light into the dark hallway. I gently pushed the door open, stepping into the room. "DeAndre," I said softly, taking off my wet coat. "You will not believe what just happened at dinner." Garrett completely lost his mind when I told him about the clinic. I stopped dead in my tracks. My wet coat slipped right out of my hands and hit the hardwood floor with a soft thud. All the air violently rushed out of my lungs. DeAndre was not sitting in his motorized wheelchair. The chair was pushed carelessly into the corner of the large bedroom, completely empty. I slowly raised my eyes, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Standing by the large window, looking out at the rainy night sky, was my husband. He was not leaning against the wall. He was not holding onto a walker. DeAndre was standing completely upright, his broad shoulders pulled back, his tall, muscular frame towering in the quiet room. He turned his head slowly, looking over his shoulder at me. He was standing entirely on his own 2 feet. I stood frozen in this doorway, unable to process the impossible sight in front of me. My husband, the man who had been confined to a wheelchair for 2 grueling years, was standing tall and strong against the backdrop of the stormy night. I covered my mouth with both hands to stifle a loud sob. DeAndre slowly turned his entire body toward me. He took one slow, deliberate step forward and then another. His gait was slightly stiff but completely independent. He walked across the hardwood floor, closing the distance between us until he was standing right in front of me. He reached out and gently pulled my trembling hands away from my face. "How is this possible?" I whispered, tears streaming freely down my cheeks. "The medical reports, the doctors, they all said your spine was permanently damaged." He let out a long, heavy sigh and looked deeply into my eyes. "The doctor lied about everything, Renee," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I started having suspicions almost a year ago. The heavy nerve depressants Dr. Vance was prescribing made me feel violently ill. My mind was constantly in a thick fog, and my body felt like it was decaying. One night the pain was so unbearable, I threw the entire bottle of pills into the trash. I went through brutal, agonizing withdrawals for a week straight, locked in this room alone. But when the toxic chemicals finally cleared my system, I felt something else. I felt a sharp, burning tingle right in the bottom of my left foot. My eyes widened in absolute shock. "You have known you could walk for an entire year?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I could not walk right away," he explained, guiding me over to the edge of the large bed and sitting down beside me. My muscles had completely atrophied from months of sitting in that chair, but that small tingle gave me hope. I reached out to an old friend from college who works as a highly specialized physical therapist. He is fiercely loyal and extremely discreet. For the past 10 months, he has been sneaking into the mansion through the underground service garage at 2 in the morning. We turned the basement wine cellar into a makeshift gym. I spent every single night going through absolute physical agony, trying to force my dead legs to bear my weight again. I fell 1,000 times, Renee. I dragged myself across the cold concrete floor, bleeding and sweating, but I refused to give up. I looked at his strong legs and the broad chest that had endured so much silent suffering. "But why did you not tell anyone?" I asked, wiping my wet cheeks. "Why did you pretend to still be paralyzed when you were making so much progress?" "Because Garrett was still watching me," DeAndre replied, his face hardening into a mask of pure cold steel. "I knew the accident was not a mechanical failure, and I knew whoever cut my brakes was waiting to see if I would ever recover my memory. If Garrett found out I was healing and my mind was clearing, he would have sent Jamal back to finish the job permanently. I had to play the pathetic, helpless cripple. It was my only camouflage. I had to let Garrett believe he had completely won, while I slowly built my strength back in the shadows. I stared at the incredible man sitting next to me. He had endured unimaginable physical torture and crushing psychological isolation just to survive. And then Garrett forced me into this house, I realized out loud. He planted me here to be his final security camera. DeAndre nodded slowly, his dark eyes softening as he looked at me. "When you first arrived, I thought you were just another greedy parasite on Garrett payroll," he admitted softly. "That is why I was so incredibly cruel to you. I had to keep you at a distance so you would not discover my secret physical therapy sessions. But then you threw that hot coffee on Garrett to protect me. You stood up for a man you thought was entirely broken. That is when I knew you were not the enemy, Renee. You were a victim of Garrett evil just like me." A heavy emotional silence settled over the room. The profound trust we had built over the last few weeks was now completely cemented in absolute truth. We were no longer just two victims trapped in a mansion. We were dangerous predators waiting in the tall grass. "So what do we do now?" I asked, sitting up straighter and matching his cold intensity. "You can walk, DeAndre. We have the private investigator files proving the embezzlement and the attempted murder. We have the audio recording of Jamal confessing to the entire conspiracy. We can call the police right now and have them all arrested before morning." DeAndre shook his head slowly, a dark, calculated smile spreading across his face. "No," he said firmly. "If we go to the local police right now, Garrett will just hire the most expensive defense attorneys in the state. He will claim the money was a legitimate corporate transfer. He will claim Jamal is a crazy, disgruntled employee making up lies. Garrett might actually drag the trial out for years and find a technicality to slip through the cracks. We cannot give him that chance, Renee. We need to completely destroy him on a federal level where his expensive lawyers cannot save him." "How do we do that?" I asked, completely mesmerized by his brilliant tactical mind. "We wait for the initial public offering," DeAndre explained, standing back up and pacing the room with a powerful, confident stride. "Next month, Garrett is filing his official IPO paperwork with the Securities and Exchange Commission. When a corporate executive files an IPO, they have to sign legal federal documents swearing that the company financial history is completely clean and that all corporate shareholders approve the transition. Garrett thinks he successfully stole all my equity when he embezzled those millions. He thinks he owns my silent shares because I am completely incapacitated. I gasped as the sheer genius of the plan hit me. He is going to forge your signature and the corporate seal on the federal documents. I said, my heart racing with excitement. Exactly. DeAndre smiled, his eyes gleaming with dark anticipation. The second Garrett submits those forged documents to the federal government, his simple corporate theft becomes massive federal securities fraud. The FBI and the SEC will immediately freeze every single asset he has. His bank accounts, his house, his luxury cars, everything will be locked down. He will not be able to afford a public defender, let alone a team of expensive lawyers. And when the federal agents raid his office, we will hand them the audio recording of Jamal and the proof of the medical bribes. Garrett will be facing decades in federal prison without a single penny to his name. It was an absolute masterstroke. Garrett arrogance and blinding greed were going to be the exact weapons that destroyed his entire life. He was building a massive house of cards on a foundation of federal crimes, and we were simply waiting for him to finish the roof before we blew the entire structure down. We need to make sure he feels completely safe over the next few weeks, DeAndre instructed, walking back over to me and gently taking my hands in his. He needs to believe his IPO is a guaranteed success. You completely rattled him tonight with that story about the medical clinic. He is going to be incredibly desperate to secure his money and tie up his loose ends. We have to be ready for whatever aggressive move he makes next. I looked up at my husband, feeling an overwhelming surge of fierce protective love and absolute determination. I am ready, I told him, my voice steady and completely fearless. Garrett bought me to be a pawn in his game, but he is about to find out the pawn has made it all the way across the board. DeAndre pulled me into a deep, powerful embrace. His strong arms wrapped around me completely, erasing the cold, lonely nightmare of the past year. We stood there together in the warm light of the bedroom, two survivors ready to burn the empire of the man who had tried to destroy us. The very next morning, we began preparing the mansion for Garrett's inevitable arrival. DeAndre reached out to Marcus, our private investigator, and asked him to immediately install hidden cameras in every single room of the West Wing. Marcus arrived quietly through the underground service garage and worked for hours. He drilled tiny pinhole lenses into the smoke detectors, the ornate bookshelves, and the heavy wooden frames of the expensive artwork hanging on the walls. The cameras were all wired to a highly secure off-site cloud server, so Garrett could not possibly destroy the footage, even if he decided to burn the entire house down. Once the digital trap was perfectly set, all we had to do was wait for Garrett to panic. It did not take very long. Exactly 3 days after my carefully planted threat at the Thanksgiving dinner, the heavy wrought iron security gates at the end of our driveway were forcefully pushed open. It was just past midnight, and a heavy, freezing winter rain was aggressively lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the main living room. I was sitting on the velvet sofa pretending to read a novel while DeAndre sat in his motorized wheelchair near the unlit fireplace. Suddenly, the heavy oak front doors flew open, crashing violently against the marble walls and echoing loudly through the empty house. Garrett stomped into the grand foyer, dripping wet and breathing heavily. But he was not alone. Flanking him on either side were two massive men wearing dark leather jackets and thick, heavy combat boots. They looked exactly like the kind of violent hired muscle you would find working the door at an illegal underground club. Their faces were hardened, covered in thick scars, and their dead eyes scanned the quiet room with a cold, professional cruelty. "What is the meaning of this?" DeAndre demanded, gripping the armrests of his wheelchair and projecting a perfect blend of righteous anger and helpless vulnerability. "You cannot just break into my home in the middle of the night, Garrett." Garrett let out a dark, manic laugh and walked right up to DeAndre. The arrogant, polished tech executive from Thanksgiving was completely gone. His expensive suit was terribly wrinkled. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, and he smelled strongly of cheap whiskey and desperate sweat. "I can do whatever the hell I want," DeAndre Garrett snarled, pointing a trembling, aggressive finger right at my husband's face. "I built this entire empire, and I am not going to let you or your pathetic little spy ruin it for me right at the finish line." One of the large thugs stepped forward and violently kicked the solid glass coffee table. The heavy glass shattered into a million sharp pieces, sending dangerous, jagged fragments flying across the expensive rug. I screamed loudly, throwing my hands over my ears and shrinking back against the sofa cushions. My heart was pounding wildly against my ribs, but I forced myself to remember the hidden cameras silently recording every single movement from the ceiling above. I had to play the part of the terrified, helpless wife to absolute perfection. "Please, Garrett," I cried, letting hot, desperate tears spill openly over my cheeks. "Please just leave us alone. We do not want any trouble. We will not say anything to the police." "Shut up, Renee," Garrett shouted, turning his wild, bloodshot eyes toward me. "You caused enough trouble at dinner the other night. I know you are probably lying about the federal investigation, but I am absolutely not taking any chances. The IPO paperwork is due to the SEC tomorrow morning, and I am cutting every single loose thread tonight so nothing can stop my company from going public." He reached into his wet coat pocket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, tossing them roughly onto DeAndre's lap. He pulled a heavy silver pen from his shirt pocket and violently shoved it into DeAndre's hand. "What is this?" DeAndre asked, looking down at the scattered papers with perfectly feigned confusion. "It is an absolute legal surrender," Garrett hissed, leaning down so his sweaty face was inches from DeAndre. "It is a binding relinquishment of all your silent equity in Apex Horizon. You are signing over every single share, every single voting right, and every single financial claim you have to my company. You are going to sign it right now, and then you two are going to pack your bags and leave Atlanta forever." "I cannot sign this," DeAndre protested, his voice shaking just enough to sound completely defeated. "This is millions of dollars, Garrett. This is my entire future and my family legacy. You already took my legs. You cannot take my company too." The second thug pulled a heavy, solid metal crowbar from inside his leather jacket and tapped it menacingly against his open palm. Garrett smirked maliciously, looking down at DeAndre's crippled legs. "I already took your legs, buddy," Garrett mocked with pure evil in his voice. "But my friends here can easily break your arms, your ribs, and your jaw. They can make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life eating all your meals through a plastic straw. Or worse, I can have them take a walk over to your pretty little wife and see exactly how much damage they can do to her." "No," I screamed, dropping to my knees on the cold marble floor. I crawled frantically toward Garrett, grabbing the wet hem of his designer coat. "Please, Garrett, do not hurt him," I begged, sobbing uncontrollably and letting my voice crack with pure terror. "We will do whatever you want. Just please do not let them hurt him anymore." Garrett looked down at me with absolute sheer disgust. He violently kicked his leg out, shoving me backward onto the hard floor. "Then tell your useless husband to sign the damn papers, Renee," he spat. DeAndre looked over at me, his face twisted in perfectly acted agonizing defeat. He looked up at the two massive thugs standing over him with their heavy weapons raised. With a long, trembling sigh, DeAndre clicked the silver pen open. He slowly signed his name at the bottom of the long legal document, his hand shaking violently as he forged the perfect signature. He turned the pages slowly, signing every single one, legally severing himself from the company he helped build. Garrett snatched the papers right off DeAndre's lap, a sickening look of absolute greedy triumph washing over his sweaty face. He checked the signatures quickly to make sure none were missing and let out a loud, victorious breath. "See how easy that was?" Garrett laughed loudly, shoving the document safely back into his coat pocket. "You finally learned your place, DeAndre. You are a broken man, and you will always be a broken man." Garrett turned to his hired muscle and nodded toward the broken front door. "Let us go, boys. We have a massive company to take public." Garrett stopped in the doorway, looking back at us one last time through the shadows. "If you ever try to contact me or the police again, I will send these guys back to finish the job. Do you understand me?" We did not answer him. We just stayed completely still, waiting, as Garrett and his thugs walked out the front doors and disappeared into the freezing, heavy rain. The loud roar of their engine faded down the long, dark driveway, leaving the ruined living room in total, heavy silence. I stayed on the floor for a few more seconds just to be absolutely sure they were gone. Then I slowly pushed myself up, wiping the fake tears completely from my face. I looked over at DeAndre, who was already sitting up perfectly straight in his wheelchair. The pathetic mask of the terrified victim completely melting away into a cold, lethal, confident smile. DeAndre pulled his phone from his pocket and opened the secure cloud application. He tapped the screen and the high-definition video from the ceiling camera instantly began to play. The audio was crystal clear, perfectly capturing Garrett violently threatening us, the thugs kicking the glass table, the mention of the IPO, and the entire forced physical extortion of the corporate shares. I walked over and stood directly behind DeAndre, looking down at the bright screen. The heavy knot of acting anxiety in my chest completely vanished, replaced by a rushing, powerful wave of pure adrenaline. Garrett thought he had just secured his massive fortune and permanently eliminated his biggest threat. He had no idea he had just hand-delivered the final, undeniable evidence for his own federal coffin. "It is absolutely perfect," I whispered, resting my hand heavily on DeAndre Broad's shoulder. "Armed robbery, physical extortion, and violent coercion all caught on tape." DeAndre locked his phone and looked up at me, his dark eyes shining with absolute assured victory. "Tomorrow morning, Garrett is going to submit those extorted signatures directly to the federal government," he said softly. "And the moment he does, his corporate theft becomes federal fraud. We are going to burn his entire world to the ground." The morning sun broke through the heavy rain clouds, casting a pale light over the shattered glass scattered across our living room floor. We did not bother calling anyone to clean it up just yet. The broken glass was a perfect physical representation of exactly what Garrett had done to his own life. We sat in DeAndre's office drinking hot coffee and waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. DeAndre was looking at a thick corporate law book on his desk, his face completely calm and focused. "He signed the papers," I said, setting my mug down on the polished wood. "But is that really enough to make the transfer official?" DeAndre shook his head, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "No," he replied softly. "Garrett is incredibly arrogant, but his corporate lawyers are not. To fully transfer the equity of a founding partner, you do not just need a simple signature. You need the physical corporate seal of Apex Horizon Holdings. It is a heavy brass stamp that officially authenticates the document for the federal government. Garrett knows I keep my founding seal locked in the floor safe in this office. He did not ask for it last night because he brought violent thugs into my house, and he was too panicked to think straight. But his lawyers will absolutely ask him for it this morning before they let him file the IPO." Right on cue. My burner phone began to vibrate violently on the desk. I looked down at the glowing screen. It was my mother, Vera. She had never called this temporary number before, which meant Garrett had forced Jamal to give it to her. I took a deep breath, looked at DeAndre, and pressed the green button to answer. "Renee!" My mother's voice hissed through the tiny speaker. Her tone was completely frantic, lacking all of her usual composed country club snobbery. "Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful little brat. Garrett just told me what happened last night. He got the signatures, but his legal team is refusing to process the federal SEC filings without DeAndre's official corporate seal. They are saying the documents are legally incomplete without the physical stamp." I kept my voice incredibly small and trembling, playing the role of the terrified, abused daughter perfectly. "Mom, I cannot do anything." I cried softly. "Garrett brought men with weapons into the house last night. They threatened to break his legs again, and they threatened to hurt me. I am terrified, Mom. Please do not make me get involved in this anymore." "Stop your pathetic crying," Vera snapped viciously. "This is the most important day of our entire lives, Renee. Garrett is going to ring the bell on Wall Street, and we are all going to be incredibly wealthy. But if he does not submit the complete paperwork by 3 o'clock this afternoon, the entire IPO falls apart and the investors will pull their money. Garrett will be completely ruined, and I will lose my house. You live in that mansion. You know exactly where DeAndre keeps his important things. You are going to go into his office right now, and you are going to find that heavy brass corporate seal. I cannot, I whimpered, looking over at DeAndre, who was silently holding back a massive laugh. If DeAndre catches me stealing from his safe, he will throw me out on the street. I will have absolutely nothing left. My mother paused, and I could practically hear the gears of manipulation turning in her greedy head. "Renee, sweetie," she said, her voice suddenly dropping into a sickeningly sweet maternal tone. "I know it is scary, but you have to do this for the family. If you get that seal for Garrett today, he promised to cut you in on the IPO. He will personally wire $1 million into a private bank account just for you. You can leave that miserable, crippled man and go start a brand new life anywhere in the world." $1 million, Renee. Just for grabbing a piece of metal. I pretended to hesitate, letting the heavy silence stretch out for a few agonizing seconds to make her sweat. $1 million, I repeated slowly, as if the sheer amount of money had completely blinded my morals. "You promise? Garrett will actually pay me." "I swear on my life," Vera urged, her desperation completely leaking through the phone. "Just get the seal. I will meet you in the parking lot of the abandoned grocery store on the edge of town in exactly 1 hour. Do not fail us, Renee." The line went dead. I dropped the phone onto the desk and burst out laughing. The sheer, absolute greed of my own family was almost comical. They truly believed that throwing $1 million at me would instantly turn me into a corporate thief. DeAndre pushed his wheelchair away from the desk and rolled over to a large oil painting hanging on the far wall. He reached behind the heavy wooden frame and pressed a hidden button. A small metal wall safe clicked open. He reached inside and pulled out a heavy velvet pouch. "Did you actually think I would leave my real corporate seal sitting in a house Garrett had access to?" DeAndre asked, pulling a solid brass stamp out of the dark pouch. "The real seal has been locked in a high-security bank vault in downtown Atlanta since the day I was discharged from the hospital. But I had a feeling Garrett might eventually try to forcibly take my shares. So 6 months ago, I hired a master metalworker to create an exact physical replica of the original stamp." He placed the heavy brass seal on the desk in front of me. It looked incredibly official and completely flawless. The polished wood handle gleamed in the light, and the heavy brass plate was intricately carved with the Apex Horizon logo and the state incorporation details. "But it is not flawless," DeAndre continued, pointing to a tiny line of text engraved along the bottom edge of the brass plate. "The original seal says incorporated in the state of Georgia. This fake one has a microscopic spelling error intentionally carved into the metal. It says incorporated with an E instead of an O. It is completely invisible to the naked eye unless you are actively looking for it with a magnifying glass. But under strict federal corporate law, any legal document stamped with a misspelled or altered corporate seal is instantly classified as a fraudulent forged document." I stared at the beautiful, heavy piece of metal, feeling a massive rush of pure adrenaline. "Garrett is going to stamp his own federal indictment," I whispered, picking up the cold, heavy seal. "Precisely?" DeAndre smiled coldly. "Go give your mother exactly what she asked for." I put on a dark coat, grabbed my purse, and drove the dusty sedan to the abandoned grocery store parking lot. The rain was still falling heavily, beating against the windshield as I pulled in. My mother's luxury SUV was already parked near the back, its headlights cutting fiercely through the dark gray afternoon. I grabbed the heavy brass seal and stepped out into the freezing rain. Vera rolled down her tinted window just enough to stick her hand out. She looked completely frantic, her hair frizzy from the damp air and her eyes wide with greedy panic. "Do you have it?" she demanded, not even bothering to ask if I was okay after the violent home invasion last night. I reached into my pocket and handed her the heavy brass stamp. It slipped into her manicured hand, cold and heavy. "What about my $1 million?" I asked, making sure my voice sounded suitably pathetic and desperate. Vera let out a loud, cruel laugh, rolling the window back up. "You will get your money when you learn to stop being such a massive disappointment to this family," she sneered through the glass. She threw the luxury SUV into drive and sped out of the empty parking lot, leaving me completely alone in the pouring rain. I did not cry. I simply stood there in the freezing downpour, a huge victorious smile spreading completely across my face. She thought she had just stolen my future, but she had just driven away with a ticking legal time bomb. I could perfectly picture the chaotic scene playing out across town in Garrett's expensive high-rise office. Garrett pacing the floor, sweating profusely as his high-priced lawyers demanded the final piece of authentication. My mother rushing through the glass doors, completely breathless, and handing him the heavy brass seal like a triumphant queen delivering the Holy Grail. Garrett snatching it from her hands, his chest puffing out with absolute arrogant victory. And right at this very moment, Garrett was leaning over his massive mahogany desk, pressing that heavy brass seal firmly into the thick federal documents. He was stamping his fake signature and his fake authority into the permanent records of the Securities and Exchange Commission, entirely unaware that the tiny misspelled word pressed into the paper was going to send him directly to a federal prison cell. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Atlanta was completely transformed into a temple of pure corporate greed. It was the night of the Apex Horizon initial public offering gala, and Garrett had spared absolutely no expense to celebrate his stolen victory. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant golden glow over the room, illuminating towering ice sculptures and endless walls of imported white roses. Waiters in sharp white tuxedos glided across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays completely loaded with vintage champagne and expensive caviar. The room was absolutely packed with wealthy Wall Street investors, local politicians, and the elite socialites of the city, all eager to rub shoulders with the newest tech billionaire. I pushed DeAndre's motorized wheelchair through the massive double doors. Our arrival entirely unnoticed at first by the loud celebrating crowd. DeAndre was wearing a perfectly tailored dark velvet suit, sitting completely still in his chair. To the rest of the world, he was just the tragic, silent, disabled former partner brought out for a rare public appearance. But I could feel the sheer intense power radiating from his broad shoulders. Beneath that blanket, his legs were strong and ready. I was wearing a simple, elegant emerald green dress, holding the handles of his wheelchair with a quiet, steady confidence. We were walking straight into the lion den, but we were the ones holding the matches. Across the massive ballroom, I spotted my family. If Garrett was the newly crowned king, my mother Vera and my sister Monique were playing the roles of the absolute royal queens. Vera was draped in a ridiculously lavish silver sequined gown that caught the light with every single movement. Her neck and wrists were completely covered in heavy diamond jewelry that I knew she had bought on credit the second Garrett filed the federal paperwork. Monique stood next to her wearing a bright ruby-red designer dress, laughing loudly and holding a crystal flute of champagne. They were surrounded by a circle of wealthy investors soaking up the attention and acting as if they had built the entire company with their own bare hands. It did not take long for Monique to spot us. Her loud, obnoxious laugh echoed over the string quartet playing in the background as she broke away from her admiring circle and strutted directly toward us. Her eyes scanned my simple green dress with absolute unhidden disgust before dropping down to look at DeAndre sitting in his wheelchair. "Well, look who finally decided to roll out of the dark mansion," Monique announced loudly, making sure the surrounding guests could hear her clearly. Her voice was dripping with thick condescension. "I am honestly surprised you brought him out tonight, Renee. A crowded party like this is hardly the place for a fragile invalid." DeAndre did not say a single word. He just looked up at her with a blank, empty expression, playing the part of the broken man flawlessly. I tightened my grip on the handles of his chair, keeping my face completely neutral. "We would not miss this night for the world." "Monique," I replied smoothly. "It is a once-in-a-lifetime event." Monique let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "It certainly is," she bragged, taking a large sip of her champagne. "Garrett is going to ring the bell tomorrow morning and our family is going to be incredibly rich. But do not worry, Renee, we will still let you keep your little nursing job. Somebody has to push the chair right." A few of the nearby guests turned their heads to watch the commotion, hiding quiet smirks behind their expensive crystal glasses. My mother Vera quickly glided over to join the public humiliation. She looked at me with cold, dismissing eyes. "You should have dressed him in something a little less depressing," Vera muttered, waving a manicured hand at DeAndre's dark suit. "And honestly, Renee, that green dress is completely inappropriate for a gala. You look like one of the hired catering staff. But I suppose we cannot expect high-class fashion from someone who spends her entire life locked in a basement counting medical bills." I felt a brief, sharp flash of anger in my chest, but I immediately pushed it down. I looked at the two women who shared my blood, the women who had sold my entire life for a fraction of the stolen money they were currently celebrating. They were completely drunk on their own fake power, entirely blind to the massive legal guillotine hanging directly over their necks. Before I could say anything, Monique took a step closer to me, purposely stumbling on her high heels. With a loud, exaggerated gasp, she tilted her crystal glass forward, pouring the entire contents of her expensive vintage champagne directly down the front of my emerald green dress. The cold, sticky liquid soaked instantly through the delicate fabric, leaving a massive dark stain right across my chest. "Oh my goodness!" Monique squealed loudly, covering her mouth in entirely fake horror. "I am so terribly sorry, Renee. I guess I am just so overwhelmed with all this incredible wealth and success, I completely lost my balance." "How completely embarrassing for you. You should probably just go find the service elevator and take him home before you ruin the aesthetic of the party." The surrounding crowd fell silent, watching to see how the poor, humiliated sister would react. Vera smirked cruelly, clearly enjoying the absolute public degradation of her least favorite daughter. They expected me to burst into tears. They expected me to run out of the ballroom in complete shame, leaving them to bask in their glorious stolen victory. But I did not cry. I did not yell or flinch or run away. Instead, I slowly reached into my small black clutch and pulled out a simple white tissue. I calmly dabbed at the wet champagne stain on my dress, ignoring the cold liquid seeping against my skin. Then I looked up and locked eyes directly with Monique. A slow, cold, knowing smile spread completely across my face. It was a smile so deeply unsettling and so entirely out of place for a humiliated victim that Monique's fake laugh completely died in her throat. Her arrogant smirk faltered, and a tiny flash of genuine confusion and unease flickered in her eyes. "Accidents happen, Monique," I said, my voice incredibly soft, but carrying a sharp, lethal edge that only she could hear. "But you know what they say about champagne. It is only sweet until the bottle is completely empty, and your bottle is about to run completely dry." Monique stared at me, her brow furrowing slightly as she tried to process my calm reaction. Vera shifted uncomfortably, sensing the strange, heavy shift in my demeanor. Before either of them could respond, a loud, sharp ringing sound echoed through the massive ballroom. Garrett had just stepped up to the main stage, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal glass to command the attention of the entire room. The string quartet immediately stopped playing, and the heavy murmurs of the wealthy crowd quieted down. It was time for the speech. It was time for the arrogant king to claim his stolen crown. I placed my hands firmly back onto the handles of DeAndre's wheelchair, my heart beating a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. I looked down at my husband and saw the exact same dark, victorious anticipation shining in his eyes. The trap was fully set, the bait had been entirely swallowed, and the slaughter was finally about to begin. The crowd turned their attention toward the brightly lit stage at the front of the room. Garrett looked absolutely invincible standing behind the clear acrylic podium. A massive digital screen behind him displayed the Apex Horizon logo, glowing in brilliant sapphire blue. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and smiled out at the sea of wealthy faces basking in the absolute adoration of the room. The local media cameras flashed brightly, capturing every single moment of his triumphant glory. Monique and Vera quickly turned away from me, eager to push their way to the very front of the crowd so they could be seen standing as close to the stage as physically possible. I stayed exactly where I was near the back of the room with DeAndre. The cold champagne soaked completely through the front of my dress. But I did not care. Every single humiliating moment, every single cruel insult, and every single tear I had shed over the last year was about to be completely avenged. DeAndre reached his hand back over his shoulder, and I gently rested my fingers against his. We watched silently from the shadows of the grand ballroom as the man who had ruined our lives prepared to deliver his final arrogant speech, entirely unaware that the massive digital screen right behind him was about to broadcast his complete and utter destruction to the entire world. Garrett leaned into the clear acrylic podium, a smug, arrogant smile plastered across his sweaty face. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice echoing loudly through the massive speakers. Apex Horizon was built on a foundation of trust, innovation, and absolute dedication. They say building an empire requires heavy sacrifices, and tonight we celebrate the culmination of years of relentless hard work. He raised his crystal flute of champagne high into the air. "To the future of Apex Horizon and to the incredible wealth we are about to build together." The wealthy crowd raised their glasses, murmuring their elegant agreements. But before a single sip could be taken, the massive digital screen behind Garrett abruptly flickered. The brilliant glowing blue logo of the company violently glitched, turning into a harsh static gray. A loud electronic screech pierced through the ballroom speakers, causing several investors to cover their ears. "What is going on?" Garrett hissed, waving his hand frantically at the audio-visual technicians in the back corner of the room. "Fix the screen right now." But the technicians were completely locked out of the system. Marcus, our private investigator, had entirely hijacked the secure feed. The static on the massive screen suddenly cleared, replaced by stark white documents. They were the offshore bank ledgers. Highlighted in bright yellow ink were the massive wire transfers showing exactly how Garrett had embezzled millions of dollars from Apex Horizon directly into his own private shell company. A wave of confused whispers swept through the crowd of investors. Garrett turned around to look at the screen, and his face instantly drained of all color. "Turn it off!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Cut the power right now!" But the presentation was only just beginning. The bank ledgers faded away, and a grainy video filled the massive screen. It was the hidden footage I had recorded on my burner phone at the rundown diner. Jamal's desperate and terrified face loomed over the entire ballroom. His voice completely filled the quiet room, playing over the state-of-the-art surround sound system. "I just slid under this car, cut the brake lines, and walked away." Jamal's voice echoed loudly, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. Garrett gave me the exact layout of the parking garage. "I have been dropping off $20,000 in untraceable cash to that doctor every single month, just to keep DeAndre drugged out of his mind." Loud gasps of absolute horror erupted from the wealthy crowd. Several investors physically backed away from the stage, staring at Garrett as if he were a monster. Garrett dropped his crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the hard stage floor, the expensive liquid pooling around his shoes. "This is a lie!" Garrett shrieked, his eyes bulging wildly. "It is a deep fake! Someone is trying to ruin me!" The screen cut again. This time it showed the crystal-clear, high-definition footage from the hidden cameras inside our mansion living room from just a few nights ago. The entire ballroom watched in stunned silence as Garrett and his two massive violent thugs stormed into our home. The audio played Garrett viciously mocking DeAndre's crippled legs and threatening to have his hired muscle break my husband's jaw if he did not sign away his corporate equity. The room descended into absolute chaos. Investors were shouting angrily, pulling out their phones to call their legal teams. The local media reporters who had been invited to cover a triumphant business story were frantically snapping photos and recording the disastrous spectacle on the screen. My mother Vera finally snapped out of her shocked trance. She frantically scanned the dark room until her wild, furious eyes locked onto me standing calmly near the back doors. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unhinged rage. "You did this! Vera screamed at the top of her lungs, violently pushing past a group of panicked socialites to march toward me. You ungrateful little witch! You ruined your sister life. You ruined our family. I am going to destroy you, Renee. Monique was crying hysterically, sitting on the floor in her expensive red dress, completely ignored by the crowd. Garrett was on the stage, practically foaming at the mouth. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me and DeAndre. Security, Garrett roared, his voice completely raw and desperate. Arrest them! Throw them out of my gala! They hacked my system and faked those videos. Two large security guards hesitated, unsure of what to do in the middle of the massive corporate meltdown. Garrett kept screaming, hurling vile insults and demanding someone physically remove us from the room. And then the absolute most glorious moment of my entire life happened. Over the loud, chaotic screaming of my mother and the frantic shouting of the panicked investors, a slow, steady movement caught the attention of the crowd. The people standing nearest to us slowly backed away, their eyes completely wide with shock. DeAndre calmly placed his large hands firmly on the armrests of his motorized wheelchair. He reached down and slowly, deliberately pulled the heavy wool blanket off his lap, letting it fall to the marble floor. Vera stopped dead in her tracks just a few feet away from us, her jaw dropping completely open. Garrett froze on the stage, his desperate screaming instantly dying in his throat. DeAndre planted his feet firmly on the polished marble. He pushed himself up and slowly stood completely straight. His towering 6'2" frame instantly dominated the entire room. He smoothed the front of his velvet suit jacket, looking incredibly powerful and absolutely lethal. The entire grand ballroom went completely dead silent. You could have heard a single pin drop on the floor. The gasps, the shouting, the frantic phone calls, everything just stopped. The wealthy elite of Atlanta stared in petrified silence at the man they all believed was permanently broken and confined to a chair. Vera looked like she was going to faint. The blood completely left her face and her knees physically buckled, forcing her to lean heavily against a tall cocktail table. Monique stopped crying, staring at DeAndre with absolute terrifying realization. Garrett was hyperventilating on the stage, gripping the clear acrylic podium so tightly his knuckles were completely white. DeAndre took a slow, powerful step forward. The crowd instantly parted for him like the Red Sea, terrified of the sheer quiet authority radiating from his imposing figure. He walked smoothly and confidently, completely erasing the lie of his paralysis, with every single stride. He stopped in the center of the room, looking directly up at Garrett, who was trembling violently on the stage. "You built an empire on blood," Garrett DeAndre said, his deep, rich voice carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom without needing a microphone. "You stole my money. You tried to take my life, and you bought my wife to keep me completely trapped in the dark. But you made one massive, fatal mistake. You believed you were the smartest man in the room." Garrett opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked like a cornered rat, frantically searching for an exit that did not exist. "Those legal documents you forced me to sign under the threat of violent death," DeAndre continued, holding the absolute rapt attention of every single person in the room. "The IPO documents you proudly submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission this morning. They were completely fraudulent. The corporate seal your pathetic mother-in-law brought to you was a deliberate forgery. You did not just steal from me, Garrett. You just committed massive federal securities fraud against the United States government." Garrett's eyes rolled back in pure terror as the crushing weight of his reality finally hit him. He had completely signed his own federal death warrant. Right on cue, the heavy oak double doors of the grand ballroom burst violently open. The loud, sudden crash made everyone in the room jump. A team of 12 men and women stormed into the elegant room wearing dark, tactical windbreakers, with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their backs. "Nobody move," a federal agent shouted, holding up his shiny gold badge and rushing toward the stage. The FBI agents swarmed the grand ballroom, their dark, tactical boots thundering against the polished marble floor. Garrett stumbled backward, knocking over the clear acrylic podium in a desperate, pathetic attempt to escape. Two massive agents lunged forward, grabbing his arms and violently slamming him face first into the hard stage. The loud metallic click of heavy handcuffs echoed through the silent room, completely sealing his fate. Garrett was sobbing uncontrollably, his expensive custom suit torn and ruined, his arrogant face pressed against the cold floor. In the center of the panicked crowd, Dr. Vance frantically tried to slip out through a side exit. He did not make it far. A female agent tackled him against a wall of imported white roses, pinning his arms behind his back and reading him his Miranda rights. Monique watched her entire luxury world collapse in a matter of seconds. She let out a piercing, guttural scream and dropped to her knees. She crawled across the floor, her ruby-red designer dress soaking up the spilled champagne, and grabbed violently onto my bare legs. "Renee, please," she sobbed hysterically, her fake eyelashes peeling off her tear-streaked face. "Please tell them it is a mistake. Tell them Garrett is innocent. We will lose everything, Renee. You have to help us." I looked down at my older sister, feeling absolutely zero pity. I forcefully stepped back violently, shaking her hands off my legs. Monique collapsed onto the floor, weeping loudly. "Do not ever touch me again," I said, my voice echoing cold and hollow over her pathetic sobs. "You are not a victim, Monique. You knew Garrett was paying my mother to trap me. You proudly wore the diamonds and the designer dresses bought entirely with the blood money that was used to keep my husband paralyzed. You funded your fake socialite life with stolen millions, and now you are going to pay the ultimate price." Outside the massive glass windows of the ballroom, the dark night was suddenly illuminated by flashing red and blue police lights. Jamal had seen the FBI raid from the parking lot and tried to run. Through the glass, we all watched as Jamal sprinted toward his expensive sports car. He barely touched the door handle before three armed federal agents tackled him hard onto the wet asphalt. They pressed a heavy boot into his back and locked his wrists in steel cuffs, ending his pathetic life of betrayal right there in the cold rain. The wealthy investors were being ushered out of the room by the federal agents, leaving only the shattered remnants of Garrett fake empire. My mother Vera stood completely alone near a broken ice sculpture. Her silver sequined gown suddenly looked incredibly cheap and ridiculous. She slowly walked toward me, her hands shaking, her eyes wide with a desperate manipulative panic. She tried to force a tragic motherly tear down her cheek. "Renee," my sweet girl Vera whimpered, reaching a trembling hand out toward my face. "How could you do this to us? How could you publicly destroy your own flesh and blood? I am your mother, Renee. I gave you life. Everything I did was just to protect this family from going bankrupt. You have to talk to DeAndre and make him drop these terrible charges." I did not even blink. I looked at the woman who had coldly sold my entire future for a check, and I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. DeAndre walked slightly forward, reaching into the inside pocket of his velvet suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, folded stack of legal documents and handed them to me. "You do not have a family anymore, Vera," I said, unfolding the heavy papers and holding them up so she could see the bold black text. "You threw your daughter to the wolves just to save a brick house. But you were incredibly stupid. You used your house as collateral to secure Garrett business loans. When Garrett started panicking last month, DeAndre quietly bought your entire mortgage debt through a blind trust." Vera's face turned a sickly shade of gray. She stared at the legal documents, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "You cannot do that," she gasped, clutching her diamond necklace. "That is my home. It is DeAndre property now." I corrected her, stepping forward and shoving the papers directly into her chest. She stumbled back, clutching the documents to her sequined gown. "And this is your official 30-day eviction notice," I stated, my voice entirely devoid of any emotion. "You are completely broke, Vera. Your son-in-law is going to federal prison. Your reputation in this city is entirely ruined, and you have exactly 1 month to pack your miserable bags and get out of our house." Vera let out a loud, agonizing wail, dropping to her knees right next to Monique. The two queens of the family sat crying in puddles of spilled champagne, entirely broken and completely stripped of their stolen power. I turned my back on them forever, taking my husband's hand and walking out of the grand ballroom without ever looking back. Several months passed, and the heavy dust of the massive scandal finally settled. Justice moved swiftly against the men who had tried to bury us. Garrett was found guilty on multiple federal charges of corporate embezzlement, securities fraud, and attempted manslaughter. He was sentenced to 40 years in a maximum security federal prison, completely stripped of his wealth and his arrogant pride. Jamal took a plea deal to avoid a life sentence, turning state evidence against the corrupt doctor. Jamal was currently serving 20 years locked in a tiny concrete cell, entirely forgotten by the world. The women who had sold my soul faced their own brutal reality. Monique luxury cars and designer clothes were completely seized by the federal government to pay back the stolen corporate funds. She was forced to move into a tiny rundown apartment on the wrong side of town. She now works brutal night shifts as a waitress at a greasy 24-hour diner, scrubbing sticky tables and serving cheap coffee to truck drivers just to survive. My mother Vera suffered the exact social death she had always been terrified of. When the 30-day eviction notice expired, she was physically removed from her beautiful colonial home. The scandal was front-page news across Atlanta, and her precious church community immediately turned their backs on her. They refused to return her phone calls and banned her from their Sunday services. She now lives in a cramped, subsidized apartment in the public housing projects, spending her days staring at the peeling wallpaper, completely alone and utterly despised. As for us, we took everything back. DeAndre successfully reclaimed his entire company, restoring Apex Horizon to its rightful glory. He completely recovered his physical strength, walking proudly and independently into his downtown corporate office every single morning. The dark, cold mansion we once shared was sold, and we bought a beautiful, bright penthouse overlooking the entire city. The warm evening sun was just beginning to set, casting a brilliant golden light over the Atlanta skyline. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of the penthouse, a gentle summer breeze blowing through my hair. I was not a terrified hostage anymore. I was a partner, a survivor, and a queen in my own right. I heard the heavy, steady footsteps behind me and smiled as DeAndre wrapped his strong arms around my waist, pulling my back tightly against his broad chest. He kissed the side of my neck, his touch sending a warm rush of absolute peace through my entire body. "We did it," he whispered softly, looking out at the sprawling city below us. I turned around in his arms, looking up into the dark, beautiful eyes of the man I loved entirely and unconditionally. We shared a slow, passionate kiss, a true testament to the incredible, unbreakable bond we had forged in the absolute darkest of fires. I leaned my head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. I looked down at the tiny cars driving on the streets far below us, thinking about the greedy, miserable people who had once tried to ruin my life. They sold me for $200,000. Little did they know, they gave me the power to buy their entire lives. The story of Renee and DeAndre teaches us a profound lesson about resilience and the true definition of power. Often toxic people will try to exploit your kindness, mistaking your silence and submissiveness for weakness. However, being pushed into a dark corner can become the exact catalyst you need to discover your hidden strength. True power doesn't come from stolen money, deception, or arrogant titles. It comes from unyielding patience, seeking the truth, and standing up for what is right. When you finally stop seeking validation from those who repeatedly hurt you, you regain complete control of your own destiny. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own peace, share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering journeys of revenge and healing.